In the 19th century, Presbyterianism in particular was a form of national identity for Scots. And remember, Scots were living in a stateless nation. So the General Assembly was their substitute parliament on the one hand, and at the other hand, they developed a great sense of identity based on their Presbyterian heritage, which differentiated them from England with its more Anglican and Episcopalian-based structure.
What happened next was a massive schism within Scottish Presbyterianism, an event now known as the Disruption. It's hard to convey just how big a deal this was in Scotland at the time. Presbyterianism dominated Scottish society. It was more than just a moral force. The church had such wide-ranging influence that it set the parameters within which most ordinary Scots lived their lives.
The church played an enormous role. Institutionally, the church from medieval times and right through the Reformation and right into the 20th century was a very important ingredient in the way that people lived their everyday lives. It was the main instrument of local government up until the mid-19th century. So the church, the Presbyterian church, the parish-based church, controlled education, the judicial system, the poor law. It wasn't just a place that you went on Sundays, it controlled every element of your daily life. So when the Disruption came along, that was a real big deal.
And so when there was trouble in the Scottish church, that trouble rippled out to affect the whole of Scottish society in a way that we can scarcely imagine today. The trouble that erupted in 1843 had been coming for a long time. The issue at stake was who had the power to appoint ministers to each parish congregation. Now, fundamental Presbyterian beliefs held that this power should rest with the members of each parish, the people in the pews. But over time, the right to appoint ministers had gradually become a matter of patronage, taken over in many cases by the powers that be in any district, local lairds and the like. In 1843, that power was wrested back, or at least it was for the large minority of church ministers and congregations who broke with the establishment on the issue. It happened here, in Edinburgh's Church of St Andrew. On the 18th of May, 1843, nearly 200 of the church's leaders gathered inside for the annual General Assembly, the church's parliament if you like, walked out that door and along the street in a solemn body, then down the hill to the long ago demolished Tanfield Hall and Cannon Mills to establish a new free church. Free, that is, to appoint its own ministers without influence from above.
The very fact that they were prepared to come out, establish a new church, the Free Church, without any certainty they would succeed, with having given up their stipends and their livings in the Church of Scotland, is a very good metaphor for the depth and intensity of religious belief in 19th century Scotland.
5 days later, they met again, this time to sign a historic act of separation to set themselves up as a new church body. And this event was captured for history in a unique way. The brand new technology of photography was deployed to capture portraits of many of those who attended. Then, over the next 20 years or so, Scottish artist David Hill painted from the photographs this epic scene of the historic event. They reckon there were about 1,500 people there on the day, and Hill managed to include 457 of the ministers present in his painting. And right here, just on the very edge of things, is a central figure in our story, the Reverend Thomas Burns, one of those signatories from 1843, nephew of the famous Ayrshire poet Robbie Burns, and the future spiritual leader of the Otago settlers. Joining the breakaway Presbyterian group took real commitment from Burns. At 47, he was one of the oldest ministers to do so. Married and with a young family, he was well ensconced in his career as minister at Monkton Parish here in Ayrshire. This was a plum position. He earned the considerable sum of £400 per year, lived comfortably in a substantial manse, and not long before had built this brand new church with seating for 800 worshippers. In signing up for the new free church, Burns and his family lost all that. Walking out of the established church literally meant walking out of their home and church in Monkton and starting again. But if he was going to start again, why not really start again and start something altogether new? Freed to take a radical new departure, Burns latched on to Rennie's proposal for a Scottish colony in New Zealand. Within weeks, he'd been appointed to be minister of the planned colony, and thereafter, he was one of the major players in its development. More than that, he soon paired up with another Free Church enthusiast, Captain William Cargill, to win control of the scheme and turn it into an exclusively Free Church proposal, effectively elbowing George Rennie out of his own New Edinburgh proposal. And so within weeks of the great events in Edinburgh, and as the ripples of the disruption spread across Scotland, amidst all the enthusiasm of starting over and having to create new free churches and all the infrastructure involved with that in this big scheme, folded into it as kind of a small footnote, if you like, was this idea of creating a branch of the Free Church in faraway New Zealand. It was a lot easier to proclaim the idea of a new Scotland than to make one a reality, of course. No one had tried to establish a specifically Scottish colony overseas since the ill-fated Darien settlement in Panama in the 1690s. That disaster had almost bankrupted the country and failed miserably. It was probably a factor in the 1707 union between Scotland and England, which now provided a new British context to another Scottish immigration scheme. So George Rennie took his idea of a Scottish colony to an organisation that had recent experience of New Zealand and boots on the ground there. This was the New Zealand Company, a group of London-based investors who saw in such colonisation schemes an easy way to make some money. They were behind the recently established settlements in Wellington, New Plymouth and Nelson. They were all inspired by Wakefield's idea, and they were keen to work with Rennie on another one in the South Island. By the time the Scottish settlement was under development later in the decade, it had moved to here, formerly the site of the Broad Street buildings, which were known at the time as New Zealand House. This was the headquarters of the New Zealand Company throughout the period of the Otago settlement's development. The key idea of Wakefield's theory of colonisation and the New Zealand Company's implementation of it was that if you could buy land off the natives for a pretty low price and then on-sell it at a higher price to all the prospective colonists and investors, you'd be able to fund all the recruitment and selection, the organisation of ships to sail out to the colony, all the stores and provisions that colonists might need on the ground, and still clear a tidy profit. That at least was the theory. The reality would prove to be somewhat different. It was this coming together of two major forces in British life, the rupture in the Presbyterian Church in Scotland and the English fad for colonies overseas that would meet and merge together in 1843. But the way ahead would be far from straightforward. It would be 5 years of frustrations and setbacks, arguments about the nature of the settlement and power struggles between its promoters before the first colonists ever set foot on the shore in Dunedin. The first big row was about exactly what sort of society the Scottish colony would be. What George Rennie had in mind for what he was calling New Edinburgh was one with a free church minister but an established church schoolmaster, thus bridging the divide between the old Presbyterian church and the new, and attracting settlers from both.
And the man who was right behind the foundation of Dunedin was George Rennie, and he was always arguing for a broad-based Scottish, number one, Presbyterian, number two, settlement, but broad-based.
This would make New Edinburgh a Scottish Presbyterian settlement rather than an exclusively free church one. And Rennie was also open to involvement by English Anglicans and even began negotiating with a prominent English Jew for potential Jewish recruits to the settlement. Thomas Burns, however, wanted none of this. If he was to emigrate to the far side of the world, it was to build an exclusive congregation of free church settlers. On this, he was of one mind with William Cargill, and together the two men schemed to wrest control of the enterprise away from the liberal Rennie and towards their more sectarian vision.
Otago was promoted as a specifically Scottish Free Church colony, not least in contradistinction to what was happening up the road in Christchurch in Canterbury. So that was its uniqueness, that was its selling point to these people who had joined the Free Church.
Meanwhile, in London, the British government was proving lukewarm in its support for any new colonisation schemes by the company in New Zealand. They played hardball over the title to any land that the company might secure from Maori, and this cast a pall of uncertainty over the whole scheme. Without land title, nothing could be done, and all the preparations, the organisation of ships, the selection and recruitment of immigrants, all went into abeyance until a definite commitment to New Edinburgh could be obtained from the British government. These delays were to drag on for more than 3 years. Time and again it looked as if the whole New Edinburgh scheme was dead in the water. George Rennie pulled out in late 1845 and took most of the early supporters that he had recruited with him. Even Thomas Burns gave up on it for a time, advising Cargill in early 1846 that he was going to accept a new post as minister at the Edinburgh suburb of Portobello. He had to be reappointed as minister to Otago when its prospects firmed again in 1847. But through it all, Captain Cargill displayed that stubbornness and tenacity that were his cardinal virtues. By the mid-1840s, he was based here in central London, working as a director for the Oriental Bank that his eldest son had established here on Walbrook Street in the banking sector of the central city. But he haunted the offices of the nearby New Zealand company in Broad Street, and no matter what difficulties got in the way, he was endlessly petitioning the government, nagging at his fellow Otago Association members and the New Zealand company directors, and just never giving up on that dream, holding fast the idea of going to New Zealand.
But he was a kind of a conservative idealist. And those conservative ideals about building a better world, following in the footsteps of the Pilgrim Fathers who went to New England. There was that real strong sense of that amongst both him and Burns about coming here and setting up this special religious settlement.
Then the scheme got a rebranding, being called the Otago scheme, and its main settlement, Dunedin, after the old Gaelic name for Edinburgh. Finally, there was a breakthrough. In 1847, a new British government was elected, and it passed an act for a New Zealand constitution that opened the way for the New Zealand Company to administer a southern colony. On the 10th of August 1847, a public meeting was held here in the Trades Hall in Glasgow as a kind of relaunch of the Otago settlement scheme. Definite commitments were now made to send the first party out to Otago within months, and active recruitment and preparation began anew. Crucially, a new administrator, John McGlashan, was appointed as secretary to the Edinburgh Organising Committee. He was to play a leading role in the settlement of Otago over the next few years. With Burns and Cargill, he became the third member of the vital triumvirate of Otago's founding fathers. Like Cargill, McGlashan had been struggling in his career at home. Deafness had impacted on his practice as a lawyer, and he was in financial difficulties when he won the new role, which really saved his bacon. From mid-1847, John McGlashan was the Otago scheme's chief booster and organiser here in Scotland. He was responsible for all the machinery of promotion and recruitment, the selection of immigrants, and the dispatch of ships for Otago. Initially, he ran the operation out of an office at 5 George Street, right beside St Andrew's Church, where the disruption had begun, and then from his law office here at 27 South Hanover Street. Working on his own with just a couple of clerks, he kept the office open 10 hours a day. By his own account, McGlashan could boast the following efforts: 35,000 copies of the Otago Journal, a propaganda organ published by McGlashan in Edinburgh; 1,491 advertisements in 74 newspapers, 64 of them in Scotland, plus numerous newspaper articles and advertisements in magazines; 22,850 copies of the Terms of Purchase pamphlet on Otago; 12,000 copies distributed of the proceedings of the public meeting about the scheme in Glasgow in August 1847; 18,000 plus copies of other circulars and pamphlets as well as bills posted up around the country, and over 40 public meetings addressed by McGlashan in various parts of Scotland.
In terms of visibility for a short period in the late 1840s and early 1850s, it was very visible because people like John McGlashan went round giving lectures in these cities and towns and villages, and they were often given the pulpits of local churches in which to promote the wares of this new colony.
From early in 1848 until the demise of the Otago Association at the end of 1852, McGlashan's office here at 27 South Hanover Street, this doorway was something like a portal to the new world of Otago, New Zealand. Letters would have been written to and from this office, and prospective immigrants probably came here for interviews as well. Once they'd negotiated the paperwork and the red tape involved, they would then proceed by a series of practical steps that would eventually take them to their new lives in far-off Otago. Cargill and Burns did their bit by way of recruitment, speaking to free church gatherings all over Scotland. But it was a pretty hard sell. Otago was as far from Scotland as it was possible to go in the world, and most of those who'd been attracted by George Rennie's involvement in the project had disappeared with him. To get to Otago involved the longest sea journey anywhere, and for the Otago pioneer bands, it was a real leap of faith. No one really knew what Otago was like, or what the immigrants might find when they got there. What combination of chance encounter, a disposition to emigrate, desperation perhaps, all came together for various individuals and families to make that fateful decision to go to Otago. Were they driven away by events at home, or were they lured by the perceived opportunities in the new land? In most cases, we'll simply never know. But there are some stories about people who were directly influenced by Thomas Burns and ended up accompanying him on the Phillip Lang at the end of 1847. Take the Cuddys, for example. Family tradition has it that a newly married Thomas Cuddy and Mary Parkinson made their commitment to go to Otago in 1844, after the Reverend Thomas Burns spent a short time ministering to their Free Church congregation here in Maybole in Ayrshire soon after the disruption. Who knows how many other members of that congregation were enticed by his outline of the planned colony in far-off New Zealand. But if there were others, only the Cuddys held true to that commitment through all of the setbacks that were to follow. They were the only Maybole family on the first ship with Burns when it set sail for Otago in November 1847. Even more random was the story of the Williamson family. James Williamson was from Stirlingshire, and in the 1830s he had set up a successful business as a bleacher and tanner in Falkirk with his brother. His wife Janet Mackey's family were also successful business people as bakers and confectioners in Princes Street here in Edinburgh. Now, being devout church people, the Williamsons had already been inspired by the disruption to contemplate immigration to Canada in 1843. A chance encounter with the Reverend Thomas Burns on a train journey between Glasgow and Edinburgh convinced James Williamson to switch his attention to the proposed Free Church colony in Otago. Not only were the Williamsons on the Phillip Lang with Burns, but James Williamson was also one of the very first Scots to invest in Otago land, purchasing one of the New Zealand company's land packages. Now, as a skilled capitalist of moderate means, as well as a dedicated Free Church man with a family, James Williamson was exactly the sort of settler that Burns and Cargill were looking for. Another to be swayed by Thomas Burns' recruitment pitch for Otago was a young Aberdonian called James Adam. Now, Adam was a well-travelled tradesman in his late 20s, married with an infant daughter, and had already been thinking about immigrating to America. On a whim, he decided he'd like to hear about the South Seas alternative.
And indeed, that's how James Adam came to hear of the opportunities in New Zealand, because he'd been wandering around Belmont Street thinking about going to the United States and I think to could quote him, when I heard that two gentlemen were lecturing in the Free South Church about the islands of New Zealand and their cannibal inhabitants. So he went into the South Church to hear, now I think it was Cargill and Burns, certainly two of the promoters of Otago, and he was completely convinced that this was the place to which he should go. So that was why he ended up as one of the pioneers, completely by accident, because they just happened to be lecturing in Aberdeen the night that he was wandering around the streets.
A quarter century later, Adams reminisced about the short address he'd heard from Burns at the church there that night. Short because the minister really didn't know much about Otago, never having been there, and not attempting to gild the lily, he acknowledged the hardships that immigration would involve. But what really impressed Adam was the fact that Burns had given up his own comfortable position as a minister to join the colonists. At the end of his talk, Adam went up to have a personal conversation with Burns, and as a result, within days he'd been offered free passages to Otago on the sole condition that he remain there for at least 5 years. As things turned out, this was a critical recruitment for the Otago scheme. Not only was Adam the perfect type of what the new settlements organisers thought it would require, a devout free church man, already married and a young father, likewise a skilled tradesman with experience in boat building and construction who could turn his hand to anything. Adam would also turn out to be a highly successful colonist in practice. In fact, so closely did he personify the ideal settler that within a decade he would be chosen to go back to Scotland as Otago's immigrant recruiter. In the late 1850s, he gave the same sort of promotional talks that had secured his interest in the scheme, but with the added bonus of practical personal experience on the ground. Thousands of Scots who opted to come to Otago in the late 1850s did so on the basis of listening to James Adam. And in the 1870s, he did a second stint as an immigrant recruiter and published a memoir to accompany his pitch called 25 Years of Immigrant Life in the South of New Zealand, which influenced thousands more. But there's another side to the Adam story that reminds us just what a big deal it was to make that choice to travel to an unknown destination at the bottom of the world. You see, Mrs. Adam, Margaret Milne was her name, proved not so keen to go. She was quite happy in their home here in the Bonaccord district of Aberdeen. In fact, she rallied the entire extended family to oppose the move. When that didn't work, she prevailed upon their local minister to refuse James a certificate of good character, which you'd need to secure those free passages. But in the end, it was all to no avail. James was absolutely determined to go, and she would have to join him, albeit, like many Scottish women of this early period, as a decidedly reluctant immigrant. Some of that reluctance, of course, might have reflected the added uncertainty of Otago as an untried destination up against a whole palette of alternative colonies for prospective immigrants. Whatever it was, Cargill and Burns found it really hard to fill the two ships that had been commissioned by the New Zealand Company with only a few months to go before their due departure at the end of 1847. Cargill in particular, looking after the expedition store ship, the John Wycliffe, and due to sail out of the London port of Gravesend, really struggled. As late as September 1847, with only 1 month to go before the originally planned date of departure, Cargill had virtually no one lined up to go on the John Wycliffe. The scramble to get 100 people for the ship before its delayed November departure probably accounts for the rather motley assembly that resulted. Motley, that is, when judged against the Scottish and Free Church criteria of the original Otago founders. Now, no disrespect to any descendants of John Wycliffe passengers, but hardly any of them fitted either of those criteria, let alone both. This stretch of water is where the John Wycliffe set sail from on the 24th of November 1847, having cruised down the river from London a few days previously. A farewell service had been held at the Scotch Church at London Wall, but otherwise it was a fairly low-key departure. No wonder, really. A mighty port like Gravesend saw ships coming and going from every part of the globe on a daily basis, and no one was going to be very impressed with a creaky little ship like the John Wycliffe setting off for some insignificant spot on the far side of the globe. there was considerably more fanfare to mark the departure of the main party of settlers on the Philip Lang, who left from here at Greenock, the port of Glasgow on the River Clyde. And it was from a point just near here in front of Greenock's Custom House that the ship departed at 2 p.m. on Saturday the 27th of November 1847. 1 week earlier, on a cold and rainy day, many of the worthies of the Otago Association had gathered on the ship's deck to mark this imminent departure of that pioneer party of settlers off on their great mission to establish Otago. Accounts were published of the ceremony in various local newspapers, from which we learn that there were 5 Free Church ministers on hand. So we know that there were many prayers said and psalms sung, and then there was a round of speeches in which they touted the high quality of the immigrants and the excellence of their Free Church character. John McGlashan also came over from Edinburgh for the occasion, and he huffed and puffed about the ship and the excellence of the arrangements laid on for the comfort of its passengers, especially the great rations that they would receive. The way he described it, you'd have thought this was a perfect group of settlers on a luxury vessel bound for an idyllic destination. But as the chief promoter of the Otago settlement scheme, he would say that. Surprisingly, Thomas Burns makes no mention of this farewell function in his diary, which only begins as the Philip Lang set sail from Greenock a week later, on Saturday the 27th of November. It's also interesting to read comments he made a bit later, writing back from Otago to a minister friend when he compared the Philip Lang passengers unfavourably with those on the Blundell, one of the later New Zealand Company ships to Otago.
They appear to be a very superior class of people, and I see nearly all Free Church people, and in that respect, very different from the first party.
He too must have struggled with quality control in the rush to recruit a ship full of immigrants at short notice. Now there's a second Philip Lang diary in the museum's collection, this one written by one of the steerage passengers, Archibald MacDonald, who was a school teacher from Stirling. Now he doesn't mention the 20th of November ceremony either, but he does give us a detailed account of his family's journey from their home at Stirling all the way to here on the quayside, and it's probably typical of the experience of so many families.
For most of the Scots in the New Zealand Company period, the rail part of the journey was actually much longer, requiring a trip to London to catch the boat. Of the 20 vessels that the company dispatched to Otago between 1847 and 1850, only the Philip Lang and the Multan sailed from Greenock.
MacDonald describes getting up at dawn on a cold Wednesday morning, the 17th of November 1847, and something of the bitterness that could be part of the immigrant's experience for many is contained in his description of shaking the dust of his home place off his feet.
With staff in hand, I set forth on my journey, leaving behind me, with the exception of my parents, nothing that could claim for me the least mark of affection.
Having packed his wife and 3 children and 3 large chests that contained all their worldly goods into a cart, he drove 16 kilometres to Stirling. They then transferred to a coach, which conveyed them a further 18 kilometres to Castle Carey. From there, they caught a train, technology that had only come to the area 5 years earlier, taking a third-class carriage, and made the 26-kilometre journey to Glasgow. After lunch in the city, they caught a paddle steamer down the Clyde from the central city quay at Broomielaw that deposited them at 5 p.m. that evening in Greenock. Armed with a letter from John McGlashan guaranteeing his family's free passage on the Philip Lang to Otago, MacDonald presented himself to the shipping agent, who provided them with good lodgings near the dock until they could board the ship.
MacDonald records the 20th of November as being the first day that most of the passengers went aboard the Philip Lang for the first time, and as the first night that his family slept on board the ship. And while he makes no mention of the official farewell ceremony that day, he does record a hectic atmosphere below decks as passengers and officials made all the arrangements for berths and stowing luggage and all the other sorts of preparations for their imminent departure. And he also records a tense struggle that went on in the week that followed as the shaking down process of getting all the passengers and stores and luggage aboard went on. The passengers had numbered berths and were organised into small groups called messes, each responsible for organising their own food. But according to Archibald MacDonald, the steerage passengers on the Phillip Lang weren't given their full quota of rations as the ship lay at anchor dockside. And as hunger pangs grew, wives pushed their husbands to do something. A mutinous delegation was then formed, including both James Adam and James Williamson. And they demanded action from the New Zealand Company representatives. MacDonald's diary is full of stuff like this. He paints a picture of absolute misery below decks for the passengers of the Phillip Lang as they got underway. No sooner had they set sail from Greenock than the ship was driven back by storms and forced to take shelter on the coast. It was stuck in Lamlash Bay on the Isle of Arran across there for 10 days by storms, no more than 30 miles from their starting point. When they set out again, violent storms in the Irish Sea and the possible prospect of imminent death prompted another steerage passenger, William Martin, a horticulturalist from Lanarkshire, to compose a hymn. 150 years later, in 1998, during the Otago sesquicentennial celebrations, Martin's hymn was set to music and performed by the Otago Boys High School Choir. The ship was again forced to take refuge here in the Welsh harbour of Milford Haven, where they spent another miserable week. In fact, it would be the 20th of December, almost a full month since boarding the ship, before the Phillip Lang broke away from the British mainland and set sail for Otago. And for most of that time, poor old steerage passengers were crammed together in the hold, many of them suffering from extreme seasickness and abject terror as the ship rocked and rolled in the huge seas. Meanwhile, their fellow settlers on the John Wycliffe fared little better. Striking the same rough weather out in the Channel, they were forced to take shelter off the Isle of Wight, and in the storm's battering of the ship followed, the vessel sprang serious leaks that needed to be repaired. Limping in here to the southern English port of Portsmouth must have been just as disheartening for the seasick passengers aboard the John Wycliffe as it was for their fellow colonists on the Phillip Lang, 300 kilometres away off Milford Haven, and likewise stuck off the coast. Even worse, perhaps, Captain Cargill was almost arrested here in Portsmouth over an unpaid New Zealand Company bill for the prefabricated manse that the ship was taking out to Dunedin. He had to pay the money owing himself, and being a bit short of cash, he needed help from one of the cabin passengers to stump up the money. And then when the ship finally got underway again, on the 14th of December, they almost collided with another vessel in the early morning mist as they set out in the harbour here. They were then blown off course widely by another storm, during which the third mate of the ship was washed overboard and only saved from drowning by grabbing a rope as he fell. Poor.
So, not the best of starts to the great journey southward for either ship, and a good reminder for us of just how hazardous such an epic voyage could be. Months of life aboard the little ships lay ahead for this first party, with the two vessels entirely out of touch with land until they reached New Zealand. And while we might like to think that a hand-picked bunch of Presbyterian pioneers would form an exceptionally well-behaved group aboard ship, Thomas Burns's diary tells a different story.
The minister records his dismay at the bad language of the passengers and the disinclination of many to attend his religious services, held twice a day and 3 times on Sunday. Even worse was the petty thieving that went on. such that before too long, immigrants were coming to the minister with sums of money for him to look after for them. And there were quite significant amounts involved as well. Francis McDermott, for example, a tenant farmer from Clackmannanshire, whose story we'll be following later on, had 126 gold sovereigns to help him get a start in Otago. Now that is hard to place an exact modern value on, but it's at least $20,000.
Then there was the heavy drinking and accusations that passengers were sneaking liquor out of the ship's hold. Burns married 3 couples during the voyage, and after Gavin Park and Grace Stobie's wedding, his diary records his disgust at the riotous behaviour which followed their wedding celebration.
There were also some births and a few deaths, all of small children. And one case of serious bullying where a teenage passenger, Peter Crawford, finally struck out with a knife at the sailor who'd been tormenting him. Now, fortunately for all concerned, no harm was done. The sailor's heavy clothing turned the blade, but it was down to the minister to administer justice to the youthful miscreant. Young Crawford had his head shaved and was put on ship cleaning duties for 2 weeks. Similar experiences awaited everybody who ventured across the oceans to Otago during the age of sail. Some voyages were better, some worse. Some were faster, some were slower. Over time, the quality and design of the ships got better, and the captains and crew got more experienced at finding the best route to pick up the winds. But the essential features of life aboard an immigrant ship remained the same. The seasickness, the boredom, the petty irritations between cooped up strangers, the ethnic and sectarian tensions, domestic violence and terror at the storms that raged. All these were a constant for all those who ventured across the seas on the long, long journey to New Zealand. Of the Pioneer Party, the John Wycliffe reached Otago first. It arrived off Otago Heads on the 21st of March, but frustratingly was becalmed offshore. Next morning, the captain fired off a cannon, and Richard Driver, the former whaler now turned harbour pilot, and Charles Kettle, the surveyor, rowed out to the ship with a Maori crew. The wind was still unfavourable though, so that night they anchored at the entrance to the harbour. One group of passengers, meanwhile, linked up with another group of local Maori who had also rowed out to the ship and went fishing. Next day, on the 23rd of March, the John Wycliffe sailed up the harbour to Port Chalmers, and its journey was officially at an end after 100 days at sea since Portsmouth. So ironically, this special settlement for Scottish Presbyterians was actually commenced on the ground by the overwhelmingly English and Anglican passengers on the store ship from London. It would be another 3 weeks before the Scots arrived on the Philip Lang on the 15th of April.
This picture depicts the scene of the arrival of the Philip Lang as envisaged by David Robertson, who painted it to mark the 50th Jubilee of arrival in 1898. The painting itself was once on loan to the museum, but it was returned to its owner in the 1920s, and its location is now unknown. Only this black and white photograph remains. What Robertson doesn't show is the drama that occurred as the ship came up the harbour and almost turned the joy of arrival into tragedy for the Philip Lang passengers.
As the ship approached the John Wycliffe, already at anchor at Port Chalmers, there was huge cheering from people on both vessels. But then, amidst the excitement, a small boy fell overboard from the Philip Lang into the water. It was William Mackay, a 9-year-old from Glasgow. But fortunately, he was rescued by the Pioneer Party schoolteacher James Blackie, who immediately dived overboard and saved the boy. To the cheers and acclamation as the hero of the hour to all who were there. William Mackay went on to a long career as a successful horse trainer and steeplechase rider. but he was always remembered among his fellow pioneers as the boy who fell overboard.
Sadly, James Blackie, a great contributor to the early settlement as its first schoolmaster, had a much shorter life. He developed tuberculosis within a short time of arrival and moved to Sydney hoping to recover, but died there in early 1851.
What must it have been like to sail up Otago Harbour after the long, long journey from Scotland and see it for the very first time? Well, the initial impressions were very positive. There was the rich bush cover from the sea to the summit, the profusion of birds whose calls made it a lively soundscape. The waters were teeming with fish, the climate was invigorating, the natives were friendly, it all just seemed so positive. And there were plenty of comparisons with places back home as well. Reverend Thomas Burns, for instance, thought it reminded him of Loch Katrine.
Writing home to a minister friend in Scotland a few days later, he set out his initial thoughts.
My first impressions of Otago surpass my anticipations, which certainly were high enough. The harbour, throughout the entire 14 miles to which it extends, is one uninterrupted scene of most romantic beauty, nothing but hills on both sides, steep and bold headlands, and peninsulas of various forms, descending to the water's edge and forming little bays of hard sand. All of them, without a single exception, densely clothed from the water up to their very summits, with evergreen woods, presenting an unrivaled scene of the richest sylvan green and alpine beauty.
If you want to get an idea of what the original bush looked like around Dunedin in 1848, you need to come somewhere like here in the Craigieburn Reserve, where there are trees, rimu trees, you can find that are 400 to 750 years old. Or perhaps go to the regenerated bush at Nichols Creek, or along the Toitu above Serpentine Avenue, where its pristine waters still trickle down the hillside.
Once ashore, the pioneers quickly got in amongst the bush-clad hillsides and were overwhelmed by how exotic it seemed compared to the forests and woodlands of their home. But the biggest impression must have been the noise of birdsong, as a host of strange birds gave voice to their distinctive calls. There were as yet no sparrows or thrushes or any of the imported species that would soon be brought out from Britain to add a touch of the familiar.
Of course, only a tiny remnant of that bird life survives today, and the peninsula looks nothing like what greeted the early settlers. It's funny really, because all of those pioneer recollections are about just how beautiful the harbour vista was on arrival.
But they immediately set to stripping and clearing the hills on either side of the harbour to create farmland.
It's important to acknowledge, of course, that the settlers were arriving to an area that had already been settled for centuries. Archaeological evidence is plentiful of Polynesian exploration and settlement around this area going back to the 14th century, while tribal traditions recall a sequence of names of hapu and iwi who have held mana whenua along this coast, which was known to Maori as Arai Te Uru, after one of those Polynesian voyaging waka.
Well, Kaitahu were really the third iwi to enter this island, or this part of the island, and by the time the European arrived, pretty well the Kaitahu people had assumed the mana of the land, mainly through marriage, conquering, and the children of all of those marriages had mixed blood, Waitaha, Mamoi, Kaitahu, but Kaitahu were the dominant iwi principally by that time, the arrival of the first Europeans.
By the time that John Wycliffe anchored off Otago in 1848, Kaitahu whānui had already had decades of experience in dealing with Pākehā.
As early as far as we know, 1809, coming into the Otago harbour for provisions, repairs, trading, and what have you. and then ultimately the whalers establishing Weller's establishment down there at Weller's Rock, and there was intermarriage started to occur locally then as well. Clearly they wanted access to trade, the chiefs, to technology, opportunity to buy whaleboats or even travel, and weapons to a degree as well. So there was a whole lot of mutual interest going on there.
An agricultural settlement had been established at Matanaka, near Waikaiti, just up the coast, since 1840. A Wesleyan missionary had been active since 1840 as well, with wholesale conversion of local chiefs to Christianity well before the Presbyterians arrived.
There was then already a small hybrid Maori Pākehā community living here in Otago Harbour, among whom was 12-year-old Mary Coleman, who would later become Mrs. Woolsey. She recalled in old age seeing the arrival of the John Wycliffe when she and her cousins and other children from the settlement climbed the hill to get a good look at the ship. And at that point she could remember there were 34 European families living here, where her father ran an accommodation house and traded with Maori and whalers at Otago.
And into this world sailed the immigrants of the John Wycliffe and the Philip Lang. Their challenging voyage across the ocean had finally come to an end. But their arduous life as pioneers was just beginning.